The Ivy House by Katherine Kim. Read by Katherine Kim. The exhausted young man stepped up to the dark house, nerves and weariness suffusing every move. The building was so covered in vines that it almost appeared to be more like a house-shaped plant, but he could see a few feet of wall here and a tiny bit of roof there, so he knew there was a structure underneath the greenery. So long as it was mostly dry and would keep him hidden for a few days, he didn't care if it was made of plants or powder puffs. He would take it. His brothers were sure to be looking out for him when they realized that he wasn't cooking them dinner and that the day's chores hadn't been done, so hiding well for the night was the most important thing. The vines had grown over the windows, if there were any, so he couldn't peer inside the structure. Getting inside could be impossible, and wasting time searching for a door might not be wise. So there were strange stories told in the village about this forest, about monsters and magic and curses and all the usual things, but never any detail that would lend credence to the tales. His brothers didn't like these woods, but had never bothered telling him exactly why. They all just got this nervous look to their faces when the place was mentioned, which was exactly why he had chosen here to run away to. If he could get through these woods, out the other side and down to the next town, he could find work on one of the barges that ran down to the river and be well out of his brother's reach. It wasn't the life he had imagined when their mother was still alive. But then at that point he had still believed that the winter solstice elves crept round each village, leaving sweets and lucky charms for children, and that his brothers liked him. He had long since grown out of any such childhood fantasies, and now simply wished to breathe free, away from his oldest brother's abusive control. He had no skills to speak of, unless he counted washing laundry, cooking meals he didn't get to eat, and knowing how to take a punch. So barge work or something else menial was his best bet. If he could find some small place to call home, maybe even make a friend or two, that would be wonderful. A brief flash of an old wish to find love flickered through his mind, and he dismissed it, almost from habit. He needed to focus on survival right now, not fantasies. He rounded the corner as he thought that, and there, right in the middle of the wall, was a door. A few vines draped across the opening, and one long one trailed from the top right corner down to pool on what had once been the stoop. The idea that the house had heard his thoughts flashed through his mind and made him pause with a shiver. But the breeze that had been warm with summer as he ran now blew a hint of rain and that peculiar smell that he always associated with lightning. That was it. When the clouds finally rolled in with the promise of the storm, even though the rain had yet to fall, the young man did not want to be huddled under the trees in the woods. He still possessed some manners, left from his late mother's teachings, and though he doubted there was anyone here, he stepped up to the door and knocked. "Hello?" he called. His voice cracked and he coughed to clear it a bit. "Hello? Is there someone home?" The cawing of a crow from the corner of the roof made him jump out of his skin. It was as if the bird was answering his question, and when he looked around and saw it watching him, he had to laugh. There was no danger from a bird, only the ornery curiosity they so often displayed. "Well, you're home at any rate. Do you think I can go in?" the young man asked the dark bird, who tipped its head to the side as if considering the question. "All I want is a safe place to sleep and somewhere out of the rain if it comes. Do you suppose I could stay here for the night?" The crow cawed again and gave what seemed to him to be the avian version of a shrug, so he turned back to the door. It wasn't latched, apparently, and when he knocked again it swung further open. The scent of empty rooms and unused space rolled out to greet him. If he were a fanciful kind of man, he would say that the small house held its breath, welcoming and watchful. Well, that was an answer of sorts. He stepped inside and carefully closed the door behind him. Evening light filtered in from the windows that were indeed covered with vines, but not as heavily as he had first thought. The setting sun, what little of it was left, tinted the small room with leaf-green light, and he saw a tidy space. A table with 3 chairs, a small sideboard, and heavily loaded bookshelves filled the wall opposite. 2 stuffed chairs sat by the cold fireplace, with a rug and a small table between them. He could see the kitchen through a small arched doorway, and another door on the other side of the fireplace stood open. Through it, he could see the corner of a small bed. There was dust, but not too much considering the emptiness of the place. It had the feeling of loneliness, of waiting, that made the young man think it had sat vacant for years, the living blanket outside protecting it and keeping it ready for someone to come along. Well, he had come along, and while he spared a thought to hypothetical enchantments and the warnings of fairy stories, he considered that even if the house held ghosts, it would be significant improvement over being his brother's slave. Jeremy could heap abuse on someone else, or better still, let his brothers wash their own underthings and make their own damn dinner for once. It was fully dark when he woke up. He wasn't sure what time it was, nor why he'd woken, but the complete blackness that surrounded him was disorienting, and he thrashed his way free of whatever it was that wound round his legs. It wasn't until he rolled off the soft surface he struggled on and landed in a lump on the thin rug that he recalled some of his previous evening and where he was. Finally free of the blanket, he turned his mind to what had woken him. He sat there on the floor, closing his eyes by habit, though in this darkness he could see no better with them open, and listened hard. There. A voice outside. Around him, the air in the house grew tense, and he heard the soft susurration of leaves rubbing together outside what must have once been a window. "You sure he came this way?" "You can see the trail as well as I can. Nobody with half a brain would come into these woods. They're cursed." "So why would you follow me here then? What does that say about you?" Dain scooted further against the bed as if the furniture itself would reassure him and keep him safe. "That little shit isn't even worth this much, but he's our property. How's it going to look if we can't even keep one stupid, weak houseboy in line? Dain had better be nearby. After I kick his ass for running off, he's going to have to drag it back home himself. I'm not going to carry him." Dain pulled his lip between his teeth and bit down to keep the sob inside. He had never figured out what he had done to earn Jeremy's disdain, and Boren had always simply followed wherever Jeremy led, and where he led lay pain and misery for his youngest brother. To know he didn't consider Dain family was one thing, but to hear him speak like that, so plainly, was as bad as any physical blow. Now it seemed that they were hunting him, and his brothers' voices were loud enough that they had to be standing right outside. Any noise at all would alert them. He could hear them stomping around, and he wondered if he would be better dead than running next time. "There's no way into this place. None of the vines are disturbed, and there's not even a break big enough for a mouse," Boren said. "Our little rat couldn't have hidden out here. He's got to be nearby, though. Check all the bushes," Jeremy answered. The noise outside increased as his brothers started to search the underbrush that ringed the clearing. How had they missed the door? It was easy enough to see, even in the night, he was sure. The evening had been clear enough, and it was almost time for the full moon. There must be light enough to see by in that clearing, even with the storm clouds. He tried to swallow his sob, but some of it escaped and sounded loud as a whip crack inside the stillness of the house. The reaction was instant. The air in the house thickened with energy, and Dain's hair crackled with the magic that stirred up. He could feel the power, and some part of his mind wondered that it didn't frighten him. "Did you hear that? I swear I heard him. He's got to be close. Over here!" Jeremy almost grunted his words, and Boren murmured some reply. The stomping footsteps grew louder again. "The f*** is that thing?" Jeremy's voice cracked as he suddenly shouted. The fear in his older brother's voice rang clear, and Dain began to feel some hope for a change. "Merciful gods, the curse! That's the creature of the curse!" Boren sounded equally terrified. "Run! Run!" The pounding footsteps and shouts faded into nothing. Dain shivered in his position on the floor for a long time, feeling the tension inside the small house recede, and the magic drain away until it felt, once again, like an old, empty, oddly welcoming hut in the middle of the woods. Leaves whispered reassurances, and light trickled in the windows again as the vines pulled themselves back. Dain blinked at the movement. Faint moonlight filtered in through the window now, and if he peered outside, perhaps he could see what it was that scared off his brothers. Dain did not believe in monsters, but he had sensed something outside as they ran, and there was very clearly some powerful magic imbued into this place. He should likely be terrified and running himself, but he hadn't felt any sort of menace or threat as he would have expected. In fact, he had felt safe the whole time. Well, safe from all but Jeremy and Boren, at any rate. The only threats he had considered were his brothers, who saw him as a slave. He crept to the window and peeked out. There was nothing there now but the clearing that surrounded the house. Grass and wildflowers turned silver by the moon, which was shining brightly despite the clouds closing in on it. The house itself had hidden him. How? Why? Leaves brushing against each other and the soft sigh of a breeze were his only answers. But a wave of comfort and a feeling of safety swept over him like a mother's hug. He released his lip and shivered for a long moment, tears of relief streaming down his face until he could finally move again. "Thank you," he whispered to whatever spirit or magic had guarded him from his brothers. A soft shifting of air with warm scents of summer and growing things was the only answer he received. When Dain woke again, the light was streaming softly through the leafy curtain on the east side of the room. A gentle breeze ruffled the vines and made the greenish-golden light filtering through the ivy leaves seem to shimmer. The scent of warm, damp earth and growing things drifted to him, and his first thought, before he was fully awake, was, "It must have rained on the garden this morning." That thought was quickly replaced by memories of the night, followed by a deep sense of safety. He sat up and stretched and blinked around at the room, which was cozy, if a bit dusty. Besides the bed, there was a small dresser and a wardrobe, and another shelf that was full of books. The rug on the floor was worn, but tidy and cheerfully patterned in blues and yellows and greens. By the windows, curtains were hanging to the side, rendered unnecessary by the vines, but still they were a pleasant cream color, with a green striped pattern running their length, and in the corner was a pair of small blanket chests. Everything was dusty, and Dain was honestly surprised that he wasn't sneezing even now. He swung his feet over the floor and sat there on the edge of the bed, yawning and pondering his next move. On one hand, he had another day of travel on foot if he walked fast to reach the town and follow his plans. More likely 2 days, and all that to reach a place with no promise of hard work, just the idea of a job that could get him further away from his old life. On the other hand, this small hut, which had some enchantment to it, had actively protected him last night, and it felt safe. Friendly, even. It felt as if the house itself was asking him to stay at least another night. It wasn't as if the barges were his dream, just a way to escape from his old life. Sleeping in a magic, vine-covered house was about as far from his old life as it got. Nothing was more full of mundane drudgery as that had been, and nothing about this place was mundane. "So, house, what should I do?" he asked with a sigh. After last evening, talking to the house itself did not strike him as the strangest thing to do. "Do I stay here with you, in easy reach of my brothers should they ever get the courage up to return, or do I continue on my way as I had planned?" "I would say you should stay, but that might be my loneliness speaking." The deep voice answering his question caused Dain to jump with a squeak that he would deny to his death. It had sounded like it came from the other room, the only place a speaker could have hidden from him. He looked around for an escape or a weapon, but the windows in the bedroom were still covered with vines, making the door to the other room the only way out, and the books on the shelves, while large and heavy-looking, didn't seem threatening enough to fend off a potential attack. Swallowing hard, Dain did the only thing he could think of. He stood up and made his way, trembling, to the door. I apologize for coming to your home uninvited and taking your bed, sir," he said, but a chuckle cut off his apology. "You did neither of those things, and you don't need to be afraid. The house has accepted you, so you're safe from me," the man said. "My opinion on this matter doesn't count for much, but even so, you would have nothing to fear from me. Any honest traveler in danger can shelter here if the house chooses to allow it, and I have no objections to that." Dain stopped in the doorway and stared, wide-eyed at the stranger, and felt his heart pound in his chest. The man was tall, even seated at the newly cleared table, and he was broad-shouldered in his plain white linen shirt. The strength in the man's arms and body were more than evident. His hair was so dark Dain wanted to call it black at first glance, but it wasn't, somehow. It reminded him of good, rich soil, ready to grow things. The bright, cloud-filtered sunlight that fell through the wide-open door made it seem, perhaps, almost like there was some green glimmering in it, which reinforced the thought. But it was his shifting brown-gold-green eyes that held Dain fast where he was. "Don't be afraid of me. I won't harm you. Well, more accurately, I suppose, I can't harm you, but we can get into that explanation when you are perhaps a bit more awake. Are you hungry?" The man waved to the newly dusted sideboard, where a plate with half a loaf of bread and pieces of what smelled like roasted rabbit sat beside a bowl of gleaming plums. "That wasn't there last night," Dain said. He blinked, and his face heated at the foolish statement. The man chuckled. "Of course it wasn't. I caught and cooked that rabbit myself this morning. The plums are also from the woods, and the bread, well, your brothers won't miss it, I'm sure." He winked at Dain, and his grin broadened, revealing teeth that were too sharp and white for a normal man. "But then we left normal behind yesterday, didn't we?" Dain chastised himself. "Eating magic food seems like it would break every rule ever presented to me," Dain finally said. He ignored his stomach's protest at the delay, now that he could smell the food. A little caution now could save him a world of misery later. The man nodded, seemingly pleased with Dain's response. "Careful thing, aren't you? Very wise. Well, as I said, I either caught or stole the food myself from nearby. and I assure you that I am not fey. But perhaps if I have a few bites first, you will be appeased somewhat, and then I will tell you what you wish to know, and then, maybe, you will eat something. I can hear your hunger from here." He suited his actions to his words and put some of everything on a plate before resettling at the table and eating. Dain frowned slightly, but nodded. It wasn't as though he could fight this huge man, and he was hungry, so he complied and moved to the sideboard where he found a plate and fork waiting for him. He looked a bit closer at the bread and thought that it did look like one of the loaves he had baked the other day. How? He wasn't sure what to ask, or rather how to ask in a way that wouldn't offend his new companion. "I stole it after I followed them to the edge of the woods. I could just reach their house before the curse pulled me back." The man shrugged, but Dain saw the flash of irritation when he spoke of a curse. "I suspect I was granted some leeway on that score, considering your presence." "Curse?" He picked up his plate and carried it to sit at the table. Up close, he could feel the heat radiating off the man. "Also, what should I call you? I am known as Dain." He tried to phrase it carefully enough not to get caught. The magic of this place made him suddenly nervous, where just a few moments ago it had felt comfortable. The man noticed and grinned. "Cautious phrasing, Dain." The man grinned again, and his eyes sparkled with laughter. "But you have no need to fear. I have no power over someone from simply knowing their name, and honestly, neither do the Fae. But yes, I heard your brothers, charming people they are, use your name when they were hunting for you last night. My name is usually difficult to pronounce for humans, so you may call me Axe. It's simpler for everyone. You can actually say it, and I won't have to suffer through thousands of mispronunciations." Axe winked at him. Winked! "Well then, Axe," Dain started after a few bites of food. God, it was decadent to eat something he hadn't prepared, and while it was warm, too! Well, it appeared he had made the bread, if it was stolen from his brothers, but he had rarely been able to eat any before it went stale. "Who are you? What curse? What is this place?" Axe nodded, and Dain thought that perhaps the man approved of his questions. Right to the heart of it. I like that. "Me? I have been called many things over the years. Fae, demon, monster." Axe sighed. "I am not any of those things, really. I suppose the closest explanation at this point is that I was once one thing, and now I am another." Axe shrugged. "Even if I freed myself, I am not sure that I could go back to what I was. Not that I remember it very clearly, it was so long ago. I suppose I'm more a familiar now than anything else." "Familiar? But I thought... I didn't think that people could..." Dain stumbled over his words as he tried to think of some way not to say what his mind had immediately thought. Axe chuckled. "You thought familiars were all cats or birds or the like." Dain slumped in his chair and felt his face heat. "I'm sorry, I've never met a mage or anything. I only know stories." It's true that most familiars are small animals. It's simpler for everyone that way these days, but it has not always been the case. Many mages once sought out the Fae, for example, or the dragons. Other creatures of magic and intelligence were also highly sought after, and if a mage or witch was respectful enough in their approach, they could boast of a powerful familiar indeed. It wasn't always wise, and many would-be masters found themselves on the wrong end of a powerful temper if they tried to coerce the being in question. But when they were successful, it could be a strong partnership. But the world has changed, and that was long ago. That was a lot of information, and it had a lot of implications that Dain wasn't sure he was ready to contemplate, so he changed the subject entirely. "Judging by the dust on everything here, your master or mistress must be on a very long trip, in which case, why didn't they take you with them?" Dain flinched and glanced down at his plate, hoping not to see the irritation his questions no doubt caused. "I'm grateful for the shelter, though." "My last mistress went on that journey that every creature must take alone," Axe said. There was no annoyance in his voice, only resignation, and Dain glanced up to see no irritation at all. "It is not a journey I could accompany her on, even if I had been so inclined. I dare say she left here before your birth." Dain wasn't sure what to say to that. Axe seemed, well, not precisely distraught at the statement, but almost disappointed. "I'm sorry," was all he could think to say. Axe shrugged. "She was not cruel, and I do miss her cookies. She made lovely spiced cookies." He sighed wistfully this time. "Ah," Dain said. He finished his last bite of food and set his fork down carefully. May I ask about this curse you've mentioned? I can tell you some, but since I don't know the original spell, I can't tell you everything. Only what I have worked out for myself. Axe grimaced, and his shoulders drooped. The expression on his face told of resignation and weariness. The old man was crafty, but a bit sloppy. I suspect he didn't intend it to be quite so long-lasting. I am essentially bound to this house, and if there is a mage or witch in residence, I serve as their familiar. With them, I can travel as they command, though it is a strain on me to be too far from the woods for too long. But otherwise, I am trapped here, and can only go so far. As far as my brother's house? Not even usually that far. I believe that the distance was extended a bit, since the house welcomed you, and I was there on your behalf. You can have more food if you like. The house has welcomed you in, which means you are more than likely the new mage in residence. You may do as you like. Axe waved at the sideboard and smiled slightly. I am beginning to get the impression that those two thugs you have the misfortune of being related to weren't very careful with your health. Dain blinked at the casual comments from the demon? Boren wasn't too bad. He didn't care what I did as long as the chores got done. Jeremy was always controlling, though, that's true. He sat up, shocked to hear the words that he spoke without thinking. He had never admitted to anyone what his life was like. People he had known his whole life had never questioned the situation, and Dain felt odd revealing it to a stranger, but perhaps that's why it was easy. Axe had no opinions on the situation already, nor on the people involved. He shrugged and finished his bread, and at Axe's urging, he stood and took a second helping, which he had to admit he desperately wanted, and used the time to try to sort through all the information Axe had revealed. The house was apparently magic all on its own, somehow sentient enough to choose its residents, and Axe implied that the house had chosen Dain. More than that, whoever lived here was provided with a familiar of sorts. A demon? Not a fae, he claimed. What the hell was he, anyway? Axe had carefully dodged the question by dismissing the worth of the answer, and Dain had noticed it, though he wasn't going to press the issue. He looked around the room again as he sat back at the table. I'm not a mage, he said. He didn't eat, just stared at the food. It was surprisingly upsetting knowing that this was all a mistake, that the magical house had thought he was something he wasn't, and that was why it had saved him. Thinking of the house like it has its own mind now. Well, maybe it did at that. What did Dain know about magic? Perhaps not yet, no. No mage I've ever known would have put up with those two fools for as long as you clearly have, Axe said. He reached over and tapped the table by Dain's plate. Eat, and tell me why you haven't ended those two insufferable bullies. Dain blinked across the table. Well, that's easy enough for someone like you to say. You're big enough to stand up to them. They would never be cowed by a scrawny thing like myself. I may be tall, but... He knew what Axe saw. Tall and lanky, Dain was far skinnier than his brothers, but they had gained their form by hard labor in the fields with their father until the old man died, and then on their own after. Dain, on the other hand, had been relegated to the kitchen when their mother had fallen ill, and had never been allowed out again. Sure, he had some strength in his limbs, but not enough to fight off the blows that Jeremy had occasionally aimed his way. Dain's mud-brown hair and dull green eyes didn't set him off as special either, and his worn and repeatedly mended clothing was downright uninspiring. Axe scoffed, then leaned forward and tapped the table in front of Dain's plate again, silently commanding him to eat, and Dain started picking at his second helping. It had been a long time since he had eaten this much, and he wasn't sure when he would have another chance, no matter what happened next, so he shouldn't waste this opportunity. How old are you? Axe asked. My birthday's at the end of summer. I will be 20 years old then, Dain answered. There was no reason not to. Axe nodded. The age which you humans consider an adult. Able to inherit or own property outright. You could marry, or complain to your town's council, or simply leave home and never return, Axe mused, before grinning. Which is exactly what you did, only a few weeks early. Dain stared at Axe for a long moment, then shrugged and nodded. I suppose. I suspect your brothers were expecting you to try then, not now. I think it likely they had intended to prevent you from running somehow. They seem the greedy sort. Where are your parents? Dain's heart twisted in his chest as it did every time he tried to remember his mother's face. My mother died when I was a child. I was old enough to be following her everywhere, but too young to remember much. Her hugs I remember, and the cookies she made, and when she sang to me. Dain smiled. Then he knew his expression was sad, even though those were the warm memories. My father took my brothers out to work with him. They were old enough already to go out to the fields by the time I was born. When Mother grew ill, I started doing some of what she did to help ease her day. And when she died, Dain shrugged. He had thought often of how perhaps, if he hadn't been so helpful then, he would have had a better life. I was, I think, 6 years or so when she died. Father died a few years later, killed when his horse was spooked by something in the road and threw him. He lingered a few days. It was horrible. Dain shivered at the memory. His father had not been a bad man, merely ignorant of his children outside their work on the farm. It had been awful to see him racked with pain and fever. Jeremy had simply carried on as if nothing had changed, though he did assume the position of head of the household. That was when he started lording it over Dain, and ordering him around like a servant rather than a brother. Axe nodded. And your brothers simply kept you in the kitchen? Dain shrugged now. I suppose at first they were too busy taking on all the farm chores. They were only 16 and 17 themselves, so a man from the village oversaw the farm and helped them. I was still not old enough to be much help in the fields, they said, and someone had to take on the house chores. By the time they were adults themselves, I was still a child, and I suppose we were just settled into our roles. Telling Axe the whole of it felt like too much. Dain found he wanted the man to think somewhat well of him, at least, once he had gone. Axe nodded again and stayed quiet while Dain finished the rest of his food. When he had swallowed his last bite, he glanced around looking for a wash basin to clean the dishes with, but Axe took the plate from his hand as he stood up. There is nothing shameful about keeping a clean home, Axe said. He stepped through the arch to a low table in the kitchen area and pulled a basin out from a shelf under the work surface. As Dain watched, it filled with water, and Axe washed the plate. However, keeping your youngest brother enslaved in the house because you don't want to be bothered with those chores is a poor solution, and I rather suspect you haven't told me the whole of it. Axe glanced over his shoulder at him, then lifted the dirty water and carried it to the door, which opened for him. After a moment, Dain heard the sound of water being dumped onto the earth. Dain shrugged, not knowing what to say to that, but he did have one question. They were here last night, looking for me. They're not stupid, just mean. Why couldn't they find the door? And they sounded scared when they left. Do you know what happened? Axe stepped back inside the room and dried and replaced the basin in its spot and sat back at the table. Simple. The house protects itself, and since it has chosen you, it will protect you as well, to the best of its ability. As for your brothers, I may have encouraged them to leave. Axe's eyes sparkled, and he grinned. I haven't had fun like that in decades. Dain's eyes went wide for a moment before he barked out a laugh, which freed another laugh, and soon he was gasping for air. You snuck up on them in the dark, and what, waved some branches at them? And they thought you were the monster of the woods? Axe just kept grinning until Dain could bring himself under control again. Oh, I wish I could have seen that, he said, wiping moisture from the corner of his eyes and chuckling again. If I had magic like this house does, I'd have done something similar ages ago. So, you think you have no magic simply because you've never used it, hmm? He nodded as if deciding something. I can understand that. Dain had no real answer to that statement. Even though I have no magic, I'm grateful for the aid, Dain said, breaking the silence after a time. The house somehow hid my presence, and then you scared them off. I'm fairly sure that if they had found me last night, they would have... Dain's mouth moved a few times, unable to say out loud what his imagination told him would have happened. He had heard the anger in Jeremy's voice, and that never boded well for him. I don't know how to repay your kindness, or, that of the house. Dain glanced around, suddenly unsure. He had never tried to express thanks for the actions of a building. Axe smiled broadly, and Dain shivered. It was a dangerous smile, one that held the satisfaction of a predator that knew it had run down its prey. Well then, we shall start from there, he said. With those words, he stood and laced his fingers, then stretched his arms towards the ceiling. For the first time, Dain got a sense of pure power from the other man, and a shiver ran down his spine, though it wasn't the same sort of feeling as when he knew his brothers were angry. He lowered his eyes to the table and tried to make sense of it. Axe's quiet chuckle was unexpectedly warm, and when Dain risked a glance up, the other man was regarding him with an amused expression. This house has needed a master for longer than you have been alive, Axe said, his eyes sweeping over Dain's body where he hunched in the chair. Stay here. Rest. Eat. At the very least, you can keep us company, I am not too proud to admit that I miss having another voice around the place. But My brothers... I planned to find work on a barge and get far away. Dain glanced around the dusty room, the table he had eaten at, and the sideboard conspicuous in their cleanliness. The warm, safe feeling he noticed when he first stood on the threshold swept back over him, and the leaves rustled as if the house itself was arguing in favor of him staying. Your brothers, Axe scoffed. I am here, and I am far more than able to handle them. I am your familiar, after all. Protection is part of the job. But I'm not. If you stay here, you will be the master of the house. Therefore, you will be my master, and I will protect you. Axe shrugged, as if it was both an obvious fact and a boring one. Dain blinked, the thought more than startling. He would be master? That was... I'm nobody's master, he managed to squeak. I'm nobody. Axe's smile softened. You are Dain, he said. And now, you have the opportunity to choose who Dain is going to be. Dain blinked, his mind spinning. What did Axe mean by that? Dain was who he was. An untrained houseboy. It didn't much matter that he wasn't a boy anymore, but a grown man. That's all he knew how to be. If he was lucky, he could get paid for his work somewhere. Maybe make a friend or two. Anything more than that was... The smell of petrichor rolled in the open windows. The storm he had sensed at dusk the night before finally freed itself from the clouds, and Dain stared blankly as the first light patter of raindrops thickened into a roaring wall of water, but he barely heard any of it. He thought of his brothers' lives, the trips to the tavern in town, the stories of revelries with friends and other landholders nearby. The festival days they came home smelling of sweet ale and spices and perfume from the women they made crude comments about when nobody but Dain could hear them. And Dain had often wondered how those girls would have felt to hear those comments. He had heard the talk of some of the gossips in the market when he was allowed to restock the spices or get some of his kitchen tools repaired. The older women liked to talk about their families with fond disdain, giving the lie to their harsh words with their smiles and proud tone of voice. The younger girls had talked about handsome men and courtships and love as if they were childhood tales that could come true at any moment, before gathering in a waterfall of giggles and shy smiles at the blacksmith's son, or the merchant setting up his wares across the market ground. He had also heard the blacksmith's son being teased over his wooing of one of the girls. The other young men laughed good-naturedly as he tried to think of a way to gain her favor. Dain had never given much thought to either group, his life being mainly focused on the kitchen and the house chores, and on keeping his brothers in pleasant moods. He had wondered, though, how it would feel to have someone think about him, well, if not like that, then at least as more than a drudge. He had hoped to find something like that on the barges, the friendship at least. He had always felt too removed from the folks in the village to join in the gossip, or to admire any of the others his age. He understood what was considered attractive to them. He sometimes had made an afternoon of dull tasks more enjoyable by daydreaming of how it would feel to receive that sort of attention, rather than Jeremy's abuse. It had been a distant daydream tacked on to the idea of the life he sought. Freedom from the violence and the kitchen. A friend or two of his own to laugh with, and maybe someone of his own to spend a quiet life with. He had thought to find them all on the barges. It wasn't that he wanted so badly to work on the river, as he simply wanted his freedom and a good life. Vaguely he heard Axe moving around behind him, and his eyes watched the steady rain now coming less in sheets than in a steady tattoo of water hitting the earth, and he listened to the drips on the eaves that sheathed the house, and the grumble of thunder. Was it possible? Could he carve a life for himself, change who he was to suit his own vision? Perhaps even find friends in this odd, enchanted house and this strange man claiming to be his familiar. Could he do it so close to where he had started and the house he was born in and ran from only yesterday? Axe? Dain hadn't even realized that he had spoken until the other man answered. Yes. Axe came around the table and sat down again in the chair opposite. Can I? Dain coughed slightly and shook himself, pulling his attention back from his memories and whirling thoughts. What would happen if I can't? I'm not a mage. He fell back on repeating the words. The house chose you. It must see possibilities in you, if not your current abilities. And Axe leaned back in his seat and raked an assessing gaze over Dain. It almost felt like a physical inspection, this gaze, and he felt the pressure in the room grow. Axe's eyes seemed almost to flash for a moment before the sensation subsided. And you have the potential to be a great mage. There is power in you, and strength. You just have to look for it. Axe sat forward again and rested his elbows on the table. You started down a new path already when you chose to escape from the situation you were in. Now, Axe waved a hand and indicated the books that weighed down the shelves in the room. There are 1,000 years of lessons in magecraft here. Dain frowned and chewed on his lip as he turned that over. He certainly didn't feel strong. He felt tired and more than a little frightened of Jeremy and Boren. But this house had protected him for no other reason than it sensed his potential. Axe had fed him and answered most of Dain's questions. And while Dain was very aware that Axe was powerful in both body and magic, Dain didn't know how he was so aware of that last fact, but he knew it as he knew his own breath. Axe had been kind, rather than threatening to get his way. "Do you mean it? That I can stay here? I don't have to run?" "I do," Axe smiled, not unkindly. "You can. The future is yours to choose." Dain swallowed heavily. He looked around the room at the dust on most surfaces, at the empty kitchen shelves, at the vines swaying low over the windows in the wind from the storm. The sense of warmth and safety and home washed over him again. The faint scent of sunshine on rich soil and growing things drifted through the room like incense. That, too, was comforting. Dain worried his lip again. "And I will be safe here." He looked back at Axe. "If my brothers return, they won't take me back. Nothing in the forest is going to harm me. There are so many rumors." "I will make no promises, since I am no seer," Axe answered him. "But I will protect you. And this house has a magic of its own, as you have seen. And there is nothing that belongs here in these woods for you to fear. And trespassers with ill intent don't remain long." Dain nodded slowly, and in his heart he knew he had decided. He simply needed his mind to agree. Axe looked at Dain for a long, solemn moment. Then he nodded once and stood from his chair and came around the table to stand in front of Dain. Dain looked up and realized for the first time with a shock just how large Axe was. Even if Dain were standing, Axe would tower over him, and his shoulders were broader than the doorway. How the man was comfortable going in and out of places with doors, Dain had no idea. He was dark somehow, with his hazel hair and eyes and beard and tanned brown skin that somehow made Dain think of rich, fresh earth, or smoke, or the storm clouds outside. The incongruous thought that the girls in the market would be casting those giggling glances Axe's way flitted through Dain's mind suddenly, and irritated him for some reason. Axe now radiated power, filling the room with it and making Dain's hair crackle and his lungs work harder to breathe. How could someone ever force this man to serve? This power was meant to rule, not to chase bully-minded farmhands away from a cottage. The thought that whoever had cursed Axe was powerful enough to do so caused ice to clutch at his heart. Axe held his hand out and helped Dain to his feet. The power in the room became almost tangible as the house added its share to the mix. And just as it became unbearable, Axe knelt at Dain's feet. His head still came nearly to Dain's shoulder. "I swear to you, if you choose to stay, if you choose this life, I will keep you safe and serve you for as long as I have breath in my body," Axe said, each word falling with significance and weight into the fabric of the world. Dain shivered with the force of them. His voice felt frozen in his throat, and he found that all he could do was nod. "We need to hear your choice spoken aloud," Axe whispered. "I will stay here. I will—" Dain whispered back, his voice still locked away and so cracking as he tried to speak. "I will be the master of this house." The scent of sunshine and trees and old forest rolled through the house over the smells of the rain, and the vines swayed and shushed together in welcome over every window. Even the storm outside seemed to leap in recognition as Axe smiled. "Welcome home, Master Dain." And Dain finally felt like he was home. Finally.